All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. There are still slightly less than 8 minutes to go before we begin, so do please sit tight. The webinar will be beginning promptly at 4 o'clock. Thank you. All right, a very good morning, afternoon, and evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance webinar entitled Facilitating Transition Towards a Sustainable ASEAN. My name is Lynn Marks, and on behalf of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, thank you for joining us today. Now, before we get started, I would like to share a few housekeeping rules. So all attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. The chat function has been disabled, but should you have any questions during the panel session later at 4:30, please submit them through the Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screen. You may also like certain questions in order to push them to the top of the list. Do include the name of the person to whom your question is directed, or indicate if the question is open to all the speakers at that time. A gentle reminder that this webinar will be recorded. Now, this event is going to be for a duration of approximately 2 hours. And without further ado, I would like to move on to the first item of the agenda, the keynote address, which will be delivered by Madam Nora Fida Sulaiman, Chair of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Madam Chair to take the screen. Madam Chair, the floor is yours.
Distinguished panelists and guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon from Brunei Darussalam. And I hope everybody is in good health. So it is with great pride and pleasure to be able to deliver the keynote address at this event, which marks a very important milestone for ASEAN's sustainability journey. So this milestone is particularly significant as the ASEAN Taxonomy Board that was established by the ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors in March this year, with the objective of bringing together 10 ASEAN member states in an effort to bridge sustainable finance issues across the banking, capital markets, and insurance sector. So the importance of having a regional taxonomy for sustainable finance was highlighted in the roadmap for ASEAN sustainable capital markets, the report on the roles of the ASEAN central banks in managing climate and environmental related risks, and the report on promoting sustainable finance in ASEAN. So with the endorsement of the ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board has commenced its journey to develop, maintain, and promote an ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance, which serves as ASEAN's common language for sustainable finance while addressing both international goals and ASEAN member states' individual and collective needs. So one very common question that has increased popularity of stakeholders and interested parties is, why does ASEAN need a taxonomy? So it is well understood that the use, application, and mandatory characteristics of taxonomies varies across jurisdictions and depends to a large extent on who is developing the taxonomy and for what purposes. But taxonomies and their ilk can come in different forms. For instance, the EU implements a comprehensive taxonomy that provides a list of eligible activities, uses quantitative thresholds, and focuses on substantial contribution while requiring that no significant harm is done. Meanwhile, China's Green Bond endorsed project catalog contains an exhaustive list of eligible projects, while in Japan's Green Bond guidelines, metrics are provided for certain sectors. While there are many frameworks that can be emulated, it is important to ensure it is effective in servicing its purpose and applicable to all its intended users. So therefore, taking into account the broad and diverse range of economies, financial systems, and social structures within the ASEAN region, and not forgetting the unique needs and aspirations of individual ASEAN member states, as well as those of the region collectively, the ASEAN taxonomy must be able to cater to these different needs and aspirations, facilitating the critical transition to a more sustainable ASEAN, while providing guardrails to member states for them to align with sustainability practices. This is in line with the principles of the development of the ASEAN taxonomy, which includes an inclusive taxonomy that is the overarching guide for all ASEAN member states, providing a common language and complementing their respective national sustainability initiatives, and taking into consideration widely used taxonomies and other relevant taxonomies and contextualizing them as appropriate to facilitate an orderly transition towards a sustainable ASEAN. So, ladies and gentlemen, so climate change is a phenomenon that already impacts us all, and the financial sector have not yet spared from this spillovers. The rise of climate change events are stark reminders that we need to take this solemnly. So the establishment of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board signifies a regional commitment to accelerate climate change action, given that ASEAN is one of the most vulnerable regions to impacts of. So standing collectively as the fifth largest economy in the world, ASEAN will also experience the economic fallout from climate change that will be reflected as declines in GDP. So a common regional taxonomy for sustainable activities that coordinates efforts across the banking, insurance, and capital market sectors is critical for sustainable finance to succeed in ASEAN by helping ensure that the capital is directed towards sustainable activities and away from the undesirable ones. So the ASEAN taxonomy will be able to provide consistency, credibility, and secure global acceptance on sustainable investments in ASEAN with better clarity for businesses and investors. So as the fifth largest economic bloc and on its way to become the fourth, ASEAN has an important role to play in contributing to the global sustainability agenda. So the common language provided by the ASEAN taxonomy will greatly assist in undertaking this role. So given the current discussions happening at COP26, which started last week, this webinar is timely to explore how ASEAN could chart its own transition pathway and discuss the challenges that lies ahead. So at COP26, the UN Secretary General made an important point, and I quote, "Developed countries and emerging economies are urged to build coalition to create financial and technological conditions to accelerate the decarbonization of the economy as well as the phase out of coal." So the ASEAN taxonomy is envisaged to be able to play a significant role in both these areas. I would also like to highlight that central banks and regulators play a pivotal role in addressing this emerging threat to financial stability by influencing discussions at lenders, investment banks, and asset managers as their starting point. So this includes devising rules to classify what counts as a green bond, financing, and designing the stress tests to determine a bank's exposure to climate risk. So the work by the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system, the NGFS, has also made instrumental to the search of sustainable finance, which includes securities linked to environmental criteria, where almost $847 billion of those assets were issued in the first half of this year. So this is a record increase from just $26 billion in 2013, according to Bloomberg. So today, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board has published the first version of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, which contains the key components of the ASEAN Taxonomy. So this first version of the ASEAN Taxonomy is meant to provide a frame for discussion with both official sector and private sector stakeholders to collaboratively complete the development of a truly effective and useful taxonomy. So the ASEAN taxonomy will be inclusive and envisaged to be able to cater to the needs of all ASEAN member states. And at the same time, it will be configured to meet these goals while keeping the global ambition in clear sight. The ASEAN taxonomy is a sustainable finance taxonomy, and it will initially focus on decarbonization, starting with climate change mitigation. That said, it will follow on a natural path of evolution and ensuring that it stays relevant and effective. And the taxonomy is intended to be a living document that is constantly reviewed to account for technological, scientific, social, and economic development. So, ladies and gentlemen, but finally, I would like to commend the ASEAN member states' ongoing passion for commitment and participation in the sustainable agenda, which is evidenced by the significant traction in this space with all the great sustainability initiatives of the ASEAN member states. And I wish all of you a successful and enriching webinar, and hope that this webinar would help instill ideas, encourage a collaborative mindset among the various stakeholders, and spur action in our journey to transition to a more sustainable economy. And I believe that with this first milestone, and in the spirit of unity and togetherness, ASEAN will be one step closer in developing a more resilient, holistic, sustainable finance ecosystem that will support a sustainable real economy for many more generations to come. So before I end my keynote, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude and appreciation to the Sustainable Finance Institute ASEAN Sphere for the continued support in developing the ASEAN taxonomy, which has been developed as a multi-tiered framework. This approach will be able to address the differences amongst the ASEAN member states and allow all member states to be able to reap the benefits of simultaneously enabling substantial contribution to the sustainability agenda, as well as encourage transition. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the warm welcome and for helping us contextualize and understand the importance of this taxonomy announcement. Now, moving on to the next item on our agenda, the special remarks. Mr. Jose Antonio Tan III is currently Director at the Asian Development Bank's Southeast Asia Department, where he handles operations in public management, financial sector, and trade. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Mr. Tan to take the screen in order to deliver his special remarks.
Thank you, Lynn. Madam Nurifida Sulaiman, Deputy Managing Director of the Brunei Darussalam Central Bank and Chair of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, or ATB. Datuk Zainal Islan, Deputy Chief Executive of the Securities Commission in Malaysia and board member of the ATB. Other board members of the ATB, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of the Asian Development Bank, we thank the organizers for inviting us to this important webinar with the theme, Facilitating Transition Towards a Sustainable ASEAN. Today is an important milestone as ASEAN announces the key components of the ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance. Based on the mandate of the ASEAN Finance Ministers and Central Banks Governors meeting in March 2021, this is a culmination of an intense collective effort by ASEAN policymakers, central banks, securities and insurance regulators. We congratulate the ASEAN for this important achievement, which demonstrates a good example of ASEAN regional cooperation and collaboration. ADB's strategic perspective on regional cooperation has underpinned our support to various ASEAN bodies, including the ATB, ASEAN Central Banks, the ASEAN Capital Market Forum, or ACMF, as well as the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, or ACGF, under the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund. Fostering regional cooperation and integration is one of the 7 operational priorities of ADB's Strategy 2030. Through this focus, ADB seeks to enhance financial sector cooperation and strengthen sub-regional initiatives. This includes facilitating knowledge sharing and working with emerging initiatives. Let me share with you 2 key messages. First, ASEAN regional cooperation in sustainable finance is critical. It is a fact that Asia and the Pacific is responsible for nearly 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions. With the various international commitments made by ASEAN countries, including reaching net zero within a certain time frame, it is urgent that we take action now. However, to make progress and ultimately keep the rise in global temperature to below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and preferably limit the increase to 1.5 degrees, requires collective action. As such, reducing climate change is an international public good that requires regional collaboration. Second, banks, capital market intermediaries, and insurance providers play an important role to develop and promote sustainable finance. Banks can provide green loans for the private sector to develop green infrastructure with built-in adaptation and mitigation measures. Capital market intermediaries, on the other hand, facilitate issuances and investment on sustainable capital market instruments that can be used by governments and corporates to transition to a low carbon economy. Based on these two considerations, ADB has supported ASEAN policymakers, capital market regulators, and central banks in the space of sustainable finance. ADB is honored to partner with ACMF in developing the ASEAN Green, Social, and Sustainable Bonds Standards. As of September 2021, the cumulative value of ASEAN-labeled green, social, and sustainability bonds issued in Southeast Asia reached $16.4 billion. ADB has also published the Green Bond Issuance Guidance in multiple languages to help bond issuers understand the process and key considerations for successful green bond issuance. On ASEAN central banks, ADB, as co-chair of the Steering Committee for Capacity Building Initiatives, together with CSEN, have supported demand-driven capacity building based on a survey of ASEAN sustainable finance learning needs. This will help identify and prioritize capacity building programs on sustainable finance. In addition, ADB manages the ACGF, a regional vehicle owned by ASEAN governments, which plays an important role in ASEAN's green finance landscape. At COP26 last week, ADB facilitated the launch of the ASEAN Green Recovery Platform, linked to ACGF. This platform will seek to de-risk investments and catalyze $7 billion in public and private capital for green infrastructure projects. To conclude, we are excited with the progress made on the ASEAN taxonomy. We understand the road to develop a full taxonomy for sustainable finance covering multiple sectors will be long and challenging. But every worthwhile initiative begins with the first step. We look forward to more details in the ASEAN taxonomy and continuing our partnership with ASEAN stakeholders to help countries make an orderly and effective transition towards a sustainable ASEAN. Thank you and good day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tan, for those remarks. Now, our next speaker is going to be presenting an overview of the first version of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, which has been in the works over this past year. This initiative has been a concerted effort by the 10 ASEAN member states, signifying the region's commitment towards a sustainable future. So without further ado, I would like to hand the screen over to Mr. Zainal Islam Zainal Abidin, member of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board and chair of the Working Group for Market Facing and Resourcing, to deliver his presentation. Now, a gentle reminder that there will be no Q&A session after this presentation. Mr. Islam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lynn. Depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Madam Nur Rafida Sulaiman, Chair of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, Mr. Jose Tan, Director, Southeast Asia Department for Asian Development Bank, fellow ATB board members, esteemed panel moderators and speakers, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed very encouraging to see interest from around the world in the ASEAN Taxonomy. We note that registered participants are from various parts of the world in different time zones, and we welcome and thank all of you for dialing in. As mentioned, I will be providing an overview of version 1 of the ASEAN Taxonomy. It is called version 1 as the development of the taxonomy is an iterative process. The key concepts of the taxonomy have been elucidated in this version, which is intended to be used as a basis for discussions with official and private sector stakeholders in furthering the work on the taxonomy. If we go to the next slide, please. And I'd like to begin by providing some background to the ASEAN Taxonomy Initiative itself. Awareness on issues relating to sustainability and climate change has been a growing point of interest for ASEAN, a region with 10 member states covering 4.5 million square kilometers across 20,000 islands and land masses, and 650 million people. Given the growing shift into sustainability and sustainable finance globally, 3 reports or roadmaps were issued in 2020 by ASEAN sectoral bodies under the ASEAN Finance Cooperation Process. The need for a common taxonomy for ASEAN was identified as one of the recommendations in each of the 3 reports, which are the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum's Roadmap for ASEAN Sustainable Capital Markets, the ASEAN Senior Level Committee on Financial Integration's report on the roles of ASEAN central banks in managing climate and environment-related risks, and the third is the ASEAN Working Committee on Capital Market Development's report on promoting sustainable finance in ASEAN. Although work on the ASEAN taxonomy is an initiative under the auspices of the ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors, it goes hand in hand with other sustainability efforts spearheaded by ASEAN, including the ASEAN Social Cultural Community or ASCC Blueprint 2016-2025. The ASCC Blueprint includes as its aims a sustainable community that promotes social development and environmental protection, as well as a resilient community with capability to adapt to vulnerabilities such as climate change. The next slide, please. A taxonomy in the context of sustainability in general is a guide used to identify and classify sustainable projects and economic activities. To promote sustainable activities and investments and drive the region's sustainable agenda, a common taxonomy is crucial. The ASEAN taxonomy has been designed to be inclusive, taking into account the diversity amongst the ASEAN member countries. ASEAN is the first region to develop a sustainable finance taxonomy that allows for the adoption of elements in a layered and phased manner, commensurating with the readiness of individual countries within ASEAN. The taxonomy complements the ASEAN countries' individual commitments to the Paris Agreement by creating a pathway and supporting an orderly transition towards sustainable ASEAN economies. The ASEAN taxonomy will identify sustainable assets and investments, thus showcasing the array of sustainable investment opportunities within the region. There are a number of challenges if a common taxonomy is not available. These include regional approach being fragmented, investors being discouraged as they will have to do their own costly due diligence, and building investment portfolios will be difficult. Creation of an ASEAN sustainable asset class will be hampered as the different standards and classes of instruments throughout the region will persist. It will be difficult for businesses and investors to progress with regards to sustainability due to lack of clarity. And ASEAN may be compelled to adopt an existing taxonomy designed for other economies that may not suit its needs and may even be detrimental to the member countries. Therefore, the importance of an ASEAN taxonomy is multifold. It provides an ASEAN voice that will be heard clearly by the international community, and ASEAN is slated to be the 4th largest economic bloc globally by 2050, where it is currently the 5th largest. The taxonomy will also consolidate efforts by the ASEAN central banks, capital market, and insurance regulators, thus ensuring an integrated and holistic sustainable finance ecosystem. It also provides consistency and credibility and secures global acceptance on sustainable investments in ASEAN. And last but not least, it facilitates better allocation of capital towards sustainability and overall facilitates the transition towards a sustainable ASEAN. Next slide, please. Under the umbrella of the ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors and its overarching aim to promote sustainable activities and investments, ASEAN financial regulators from 4 sectoral bodies have come together to establish the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, or ATB. The 4 sectoral bodies are the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, or ACMF, the ASEAN Insurance Regulators Meeting, AIRM, the ASEAN Senior Level Committee on Financial Integration, the SLC, and the ASEAN Working Committee on Capital Market Development, or WCCMD. Members of the board comprise organizations from all 10 ASEAN member countries selected by their respective sectoral bodies, as you can see listed on the right side of the slide. The ATB and the taxonomy represent ASEAN's collective commitment in further developing sustainable finance within the region. Now let's move on to the next slide, where we'll go through the overview of version 1 of the ASEAN taxonomy. First, let me share with you 5 principles that guide the development and implementation of the ASEAN taxonomy. Principle 1 is that the taxonomy will be an overarching guide for all AMS, providing a common language and complementing their respective sustainability initiatives. Principle 2 is that the taxonomy will consider widely used taxonomies and other relevant taxonomies as appropriate, and will be contextualized to facilitate the orderly transition towards sustainable ASEAN economies. The third principle is for the taxonomy to be inclusive and beneficial to all AMS. AMS being the ASEAN member states. Principle 4 is that the taxonomy will provide a credible framework and definitions and be science-based where appropriate. And principle 5 is for the taxonomy to be aligned with sustainability initiatives undertaken by the respective financial sectors, or at least not to be in conflict. Moving to the next slide, we'll look at the taxonomy design. As mentioned earlier, the taxonomy is intended to be the principal reference point for sustainable projects and activities in ASEAN. To cater for the different standards of development and economic activity among ASEAN's 10 member countries, the taxonomy has been conceived according to a multi-tiered concept, having a foundation framework consisting of common principles which form the foundation of the taxonomy, and a plus standard comprising subsequent tiers with more detailed matrix and thresholds. The taxonomy could thus be described as having 2 floors under the same roof. In this house, member countries can then adopt the tiers that are most suitable and appropriate for the needs of their respective financial sectors, catering to the different states of readiness within ASEAN. If I may elaborate further, the foundation framework is proposed to be applicable to all ASEAN member states, stakeholders in the financial sector and business enterprises, and it is underpinned by environmental objectives and essential criteria to guide AMS in classifying economic activities, and allows a qualitative assessment of activities. The plus standard is an additional guidance and scope for AMS to further qualify and benchmark eligible green activities and investments, and sets activity level criteria and thresholds to determine if an activity contributes to the environmental objectives of the taxonomy and can therefore be considered taxonomy aligned. If I could just provide a bit more clarity, this slide provides the overview of how classification of activities are done under both the foundation framework and plus standard, illustrating how the various components fit together as a cohesive overall classification framework. Under the foundation framework, economic activities must fulfill the listed the 4 environmental objectives and the 2 essential criteria, which are qualitative-based assessment. Based on these objectives and criteria, an activity can be classified as green FF, representing foundation framework, amber FF, or red FF. And under the plus standard, matrix and thresholds are applied to the identified focus and enabling sectors. There's 6 focus sectors and 3 enabling sectors, as you can see. And this is in order to determine if an economic activity is eligible for the ASEAN taxonomy. Activities can then be classified as either green PS, amber PS, or red PS. We will discuss what these categories mean a bit later. We move on to the next slide. So just go a bit deeper into the 4 environmental objectives and the essential criteria, 2 essential criteria. Under the foundation framework, these 4 environmental objectives apply to all AMS, players in the financial sector, as well as business enterprises. Economic activities should also be assessed against the relevant environmental laws instituted by each AMS as a minimum safeguard to ensure there is no contravention with local environmental regulations. Looking at the 4 environmental objectives, they are all equally important and consist of the first environmental objective, which is climate change mitigation, being the focus of version 1 of the taxonomy, and future versions of the taxonomy will integrate other environmental objectives. The main aim here is for reduction of GHG emissions into the atmosphere. Objective is considered fulfilled if an activity makes a substantial contribution to one or more of the following, which is avoid GHG emission, reduce GHG emission, or enable others to avoid or reduce GHG emission. An activity not already low or zero emission should demonstrate the capability to avoid or reduce GHG emissions in line with the relevant best practices. The second environmental objective is climate change adaptation. Process or actions to lower negative effects caused by climate change and increase resilience to withstand the adverse physical impact of current and future climate change. This objective is considered met if it fulfills either one or both of the following criteria. It implements measures to increase its own resilience to climate change and/or enables others to increase their resilience to climate change. At the same time, it must not adversely affect adaptation efforts or increase the physical risks of others. The third objective is protection of healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. Economic activities in natural resource-intensive sectors should not be made at the expense of the natural ecosystem and biodiversity. The main aim under this objective is to minimize or eliminate negative effects of business operations on natural ecosystem and biodiversity. The objective is considered fulfilled if some or all of the 11 listed criteria which are in the taxonomy are met. The fourth objective is promote resource resilience and transition to circular economy. Objective for this is considered met if it fulfills either one or both of the following criteria: adjusting business operations to conserve raw materials, energy, water, and other natural resources, and implementing circular economy principles via adapted products, production, technologies, and processes. For the 2 essential criteria, which help to achieve the environmental objectives in the most transparent manner, the first criteria is to do no significant harm. Activities that contribute substantially to an environmental objective shall not significantly harm any of the other environmental objectives. And the second criteria is remedial measures to transition, where actions to mitigate climate and/or environmental impacts should be assessed against the following considerations, which is actions should anticipate and avoid risks and impacts at the outset. And if avoidance is not possible, it should minimize or reduce risks and impacts to acceptable levels. And assessment should be proportional to the scale of business operations. We could move on to the next slide. The foundation framework uses a single sector agnostic decision tree, as you can see on the slide. This is based on climate change mitigation to conduct a high-level assessment of activities and proceed to classify them into one of 3 categories, which is the green FF, which clearly contributes to or enables climate change mitigation and requires no thresholds. Amber FF, where activities contributing to decarbonization, where mitigation of other harm to environmental objectives is necessary. And the red FF, where it does not contribute to or enable climate change mitigation, or it fails to meet other safeguards. Moving to the next slide, as we move to the plus standard. Under the plus standard, the classification of activities is sector-based. Version 1 of the taxonomy covers key sectors and activities that are important to achieving climate change mitigation through their own performance and by enabling it for others. As each economic activity will have respective detailed screening criteria, there is a need to identify the scope of activities to include in the taxonomy by selecting focus sectors. To identify the focus sectors, it was necessary to first select an industry classification system to be used. The taxonomy's focus sectors were chosen based on industrial classification of the International Standard Industrial Classification, or ISIC, Revision 4. ISIC was primarily used due to its compatibility with the ASEAN member states' national standard industrial classification codes, and also the industrial classification codes used in other major taxonomies, which will in turn enable interoperability between the taxonomies. Focus sectors which are most material were identified according to the environmental and economic importance to ASEAN, based on data on two points. One is on GHG emissions, and secondly on gross value added, or GVA. And to this, the 6 identified focus sectors that account for over 85% of GHG emissions and 55% of the GVA in ASEAN are as listed on the slide, and they are ranked as shown, namely the first, agriculture, forestry and fishing. Second is manufacturing. Third is electricity, gas, steam and air conditioning supply. Fourth is transportation and storage. Fifth is construction and real estate activities. And sixth is water supply, sewage, waste management and remediation activities. And there are also 3 enabling sectors that are included as they improve the performance of the other sectors and activities. They do not themselves risk harm to environmental objectives. These enabling sectors are also important for the decarbonization of the economy and might not otherwise be included if only emissions intensity and GVA are considered. Moving on to the next slide. As a further extension of the PLUS standard, the PLUS standard will comprise activity level technical screening criteria for activities within the focus sectors mentioned in the previous slide. The PLUS standard complements the foundation framework by providing activity level criteria and thresholds to determine if an activity is green under the PLUS standard. So is green PS or amber PS or red PS. So the PLUS standard will employ a stack approach in developing activity level thresholds. Each economic activity will have multiple thresholds at a single point in time. This is to cater for different starting points of entities across ASEAN undertaking a particular activity. This approach allows for higher emissions for a limited period while incentivizing progression to lower emissions by retiring the less ambitious tiers over time. If I could provide a conceptual example of the 3-tier framework using the stack approach, tier 1 is where the threshold is less stringent, determined by a grid matrix. The threshold is static and will be retired at an established point in time, which will be determined in the future version of the taxonomy, after which this tier would no longer be used to consider taxonomy eligibility. In tier 2, the threshold is more stringent than tier 3. It is static, will be retired also at the established point in time to be determined in the future version. And this tier will also no longer be used to consider taxonomy eligibility after a certain point after that certain point of time. And tier 1 is the most ambitious threshold, aligned depending on activity with global net zero by 2050 and or the Paris Agreement, and thus with other major international taxonomies. This threshold is dynamic and will decline to 0 over time. With that, ladies and gentlemen, on the next slide, having shared some of the key components of the first version of the ASEAN taxonomy, what are the next steps for the ASEAN Taxonomy Board? The ASEAN taxonomy is intended to be a living document and will be frequently revised to account for technological, scientific, and economic developments. The ATB will be carrying out targeted consultation with key stakeholders where input received will be utilized in the further development of the ASEAN taxonomy. And with that, if I could just quickly move on to the next slide, was to share with you where you can download the ASEAN Taxonomy. Copies are available now on the 3 websites or 4 websites that you see on the slides, and these are already available for your views. Thank you, everyone. With that, I hand it over to Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Islan, for that presentation. It's truly encouraging to see the amount of progress that has already been made in just the 8 months since the ATB was established. Now, we have already placed links to the version 1 of the ASEAN Taxonomy document in the chat if any of our audience members would like to download the document and perhaps have a read through in further detail. But of course, the question is, even with the framework of this ASEAN Taxonomy taking shape, what would this transition period look like for the region, and how do we facilitate that shift? Moderating our panel session today, which will tackle those questions and more, is Mr. Eugene Wong, CEO of the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, which is the host of the ATB. Joining him is a panel of experts whom you see on the slide in front of you now. Mr. Eric Francia, President and the CEO of AC Energy Corporation, which under his leadership has become one of the largest renewable energy platforms in Southeast Asia. Eric is also a managing director and member of the management committee of AC Energy's parent company, the Ayala Corporation, and chairman of Ayala's investment committee. We also have Mr. Stuart James, Managing Director and Head of Public Affairs in HSBC for the Asia Pacific. Prior to that, Stuart was a long-standing public servant who dealt with climate finance from a number of perspectives, including 5 years on the board of the World Bank. Now, Stuart most recently has been chairing the Working Group on Transition Standards as part of ASEAN's industry outreach. Next on our panel, we have Mr. Mushtaq Kapasi, Managing Director and Chief Representative for the Asia Pacific at the International Capital Markets Association. Mushtaq is involved in senior strategy, capital market, and legal roles covering the region at international banks active in Asia, and has also held several other roles, including consultant on financial structures of renewable energy projects in frontier markets. And rounding out our panel is Mr. Shiv Sivaraja, Head of Energy and Resources for Asia and Oceania at MUFG Bank. Shiv has covered the energy sector here in Asia for over a decade. He is actively involved in developing and driving MUFG's transition finance strategy as chair of the bank's APAC Transition Finance Working Group and an active member of 3 other internal and external energy transition working groups. So I'd now like to invite all our panelists to turn their cameras on for the duration of this webinar, which will begin quite shortly. And while we do that, it is my great pleasure to hand this over to our moderator, Mr. Eugene Wong. Eugene, take it away.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Well, at COP26, banks, insurers, and investors looking after 40% of the global private capital stock, with $130 trillion at their disposal, pledged to support the greening of our world. There's no doubt that private capital is essential if the Paris Agreement goals are going to be met. In fact, Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, remarked at COP26, and I will quote, that as big as the public sector effort is across all countries, the $100 trillion plus price tag to address climate change globally is far bigger, and the private sector needs to play a bigger role. ASEAN needs a robust, sustainable finance ecosystem if it's going to mobilize private capital. And ASEAN Taxonomy, a transition pathway, and disclosures have been identified as the 3 pillars of ASEAN's sustainable finance ecosystem. Even with all the pledges at COP26, it looks like we're heading for a 2.4-degree temperature increase. As such, we need to get everyone on board quicker and the money flowing faster. We are indeed privileged today to have with us an experienced panel with deep insights on how ASEAN can use and benefit from the ASEAN Taxonomy in this very urgent transition that the region has to make. Eric, Mushtaq, Shiv, Stuart, welcome and thank you for making time to be with us today. I'd like to start off by inviting the panelists to share with us their perspectives on where we are on the sustainable finance journey and what's important for us. Perhaps I can start with the person I see on my screen first, and that would be Mushtaq. Over to you, Mushtaq.
Thank you so much, Eugene. It's a real honor to be on this panel, and an even greater honor to have been able to work with you and all colleagues in ASEAN and the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum on this important initiative. As you say, it's an overused word, but it is a sustainable finance journey. And I just want to put this in context, even though this is a remarkable achievement today, this taxonomy, this is not the first step, and it won't be the last step. We have started working with you and the securities regulators of the ASEAN nations even 4 years ago, 5 years ago, in fact, on what was a groundbreaking and really the first of its kind in the world, public sector, private sector partnership to produce the green bond standards and the social bond standards for the ASEAN region. And it's sometimes difficult to remember, but even 5 or 6, 7 years ago, there really wasn't much in terms of green finance, in terms of sustainable finance in the world. It was very much a niche kind of activity, and it had credibility, but it didn't have that much uptake. And it didn't have that much trust in terms of real business model from mainstream bankers, even from mainstream regulators. That landscape has completely transformed today. And I think it's fair to say that the ASEAN region and the official sector in ASEAN, as opposed to the private sector, although they've been involved, has really been a leader in this respect. So I'm really happy that we can continue that cooperation. I think we have a long way to go, though. Not just in terms of putting together the taxonomy itself, but in terms of overall policy. I think one thing that's very clear to me personally from COP26 and all the discussions that we've seen over the last couple of years is that the financial markets can help, that we can help facilitate the massive amounts of investment that are required into sustainable finance, into renewable projects, into cleaner industry in the region. But we also need the overarching policy direction that is a political question, and that is a question of changing the behavior of overall economies and overall societies. And then the finance industry can follow and help to facilitate that. A couple other points I'd like to make in really big picture. First of all, one transformation that I've seen in the sustainable finance world over the last few years is a shift from market-led, bottom-up standards and guidelines for sustainability products, sustainability standards, to a really important involvement of the official sector in driving that. And we're seeing, I was in a discussion earlier today and somebody talked about taxonomania, which is an interesting little word, but you are seeing a large number of new initiatives in regulation and taxonomies by the official sector to encourage the growth of sustainable finance. I think that's extremely important. And I think it's also important not to overemphasize the differences, but to really remember a lot of the commonalities involved and how it's important that individual countries, individual regions are all having these discussions in a very robust manner that merge international considerations with local realities and local pathways. The final thing I'll say just for my introduction is that we at ICMA, like many others in the market, like many other stakeholders, have considered what should a taxonomy be used for? What are the best practices in terms of an international taxonomy? And let me just summarize those right now from what we at ICMA and our membership overall have considered to be the best things that a taxonomy can do. There are 5 points I'd like to say. First of all, taxonomy should be targeted in its purpose and objectives. It should be additional in relation to existing international frameworks. It should be usable by the market for all intended purposes. It should be open and compatible with complementary approaches and initiatives. And last but not least, it should be transition enabled, incorporating trajectories and pathways. I think the ASEAN taxonomy has resoundingly covered all of these points, and certainly the discussions that we've had have done so as well. It remains to be seen, in the details, how this will play out in the market and how it will be interpreted into national and international standards. But I think the start that we've had and that the ASEAN Taxonomy Board has put together so far has been actually quite amazing considering the variety of ASEAN countries. And I look forward to further growth and further cooperation with you. Thanks, Eugene.
Thank you very much, Mushtaq. That's very encouraging. If I can invite Shiv to follow on with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugene. Hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me clearly, despite the rain outside. Tempting to say I agree with all of that and leave it at that, but I'll try and come up with some of my own comments. Look, I know that sustainability, the energy transition, and many of the movements related to them have caused some concern within some people in ASEAN. I think people are concerned about what it's really going to mean to them economically, what it's going to mean to them in terms of change of lifestyle, and whether or not it's even fair that some of this stuff is foisted upon them. Well, I've got something I want to admit to everyone here, and that's very simply that I have some sympathy. I have worked with many of the fossil fuel industries for the last decade, and this movement, or these movements, are effectively calling for the elimination, curtailment, or a drastic change in practice for most of the clients and industries I've been working with for quite some time. So when this first came about for me, I was also personally very defensive. I felt like, okay, look, it's an interesting movement. It seems to make sense, but actually, is it realistic? Is it pragmatic? And is it something that we should be doing? And over the years, I've spent time listening and talking to lots of different types of people. I've talked to the environmental evangelists, or I should say, and I've talked to the climate change skeptics, and I've talked to a lot of people in between. And I've come to some conclusions, and I wanted to share that just in case there are some people out there who, like me, perhaps a few years ago, also felt like this was something that wasn't as necessary as people are making out. The first thing I want to say is that we only really have one planet. I know we're all doing our best to get out to Mars and try and find other places around the world, and humankind's not doing bad, but that's still very early stage. As far as we can see, there's only one planet that we can inhabit very comfortably, and it's this one. The second thing is, most of us accept that the population of this planet is growing. And we also accept that we want the people that live on this planet to have comfort, security, food, energy, all the things that make life decent and worthwhile. If we accept those three things, then essentially the only logical conclusion is that we have to look after this planet, right? We have to accept that the natural processes that are out there at the moment, whether it's in our atmosphere, in our seas, in our soil, need to be protected and need to be maintained as much as possible. And we need to stay as close to what is a natural balance as much as possible. The second thing, argument that I came about that I thought was interesting was just a few years ago, one of the big concerns was not so much the environmental movements, but it was whether or not we were going to run out of oil and gas, right? You guys may remember peak oil. Back in 2013, this was the big discussion. Now, that's a very real concern. And back then, the concern was not so much about the emissions, but it was, well, this is such an important component of our lives. And let's face it, oil and gas have built the modern world. The reality is, what's going to happen if we run out of this stuff? It's not just the fuel, remember. Oil and gas are also the building blocks of petrochemicals, which are the building blocks of so many things that we all use in our day-to-day lives. So in many ways, even if you don't want to go down that route, it doesn't make any sense to keep pursuing the exploitation of oil and gas, particularly with a growing population. And the final point I wanted to make was this change is completely inevitable. This is completely clear to me. The world is moving this way. And if you choose not to go with it, if you choose to sit back, you run a risk of being left behind. And what does being left behind mean? It means not being considered for investment decisions. It's not being considered for lending decisions. It may be becoming a victim of carbon border taxes as money from your products pour into other economies. So you have a choice to actually get on the train and try and bring your voice to the narrative, or sit back and inevitably play catch up later. So hopefully some of those points make sense. I wanted to just talk about one other thing before I move on, and which is I'm a commercial banker. And I wanted to talk a little bit about where the commercial banks are. Now, I can't speak for the entire banking market, but I hope I've got enough experience to say a few words that make sense to most people. The banks are primarily considered with four things. One, their own ESG standards, and for many of them, their net zero commitments, which are coming fast and very much to the forefront for many institutions. Two, the potential risks to their reputation of backing companies that are seen not to be part of this big transition and what is considered to be the right thing to do. Three, the credit risks related to backing companies that are operating in contracting markets and are not taking that into account, just simply not considering it. So you're putting money out the door to these people. Are they actually going to be able to pay you back? And the last one is the liquidity risk. What happens when all your peers and other institutions walk away from your clients and you're the last one standing? And these are very serious considerations by all financial institutions. And no matter where you are on the spectrum, I believe all of them are thinking of it in some way, shape, or form. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shiv. Your comments remind me of a book I read in my university days, at the risk of giving my age away, called The Limits of Growth. And the limits of growth at that time, with all the limited computing power, had actually forecasted where we would be in 2100, and the answer is in a very bad place. It's interesting that a few years back, the models were run again, and we were pretty much close to where the limits of growth had predicted we'd be. So this is indeed a very serious problem that we're looking at. Stuart, can I invite you to go next?
Sure, thank you very much, Eugene, and hello, everybody. It really is an honor to be here as ASEAN unveils its proposals for taxonomy and transition. And of course, as COP26 plays out in Glasgow. I'm going to pick up a little bit on some of the concerns about the nature of this transition and what it requires of countries in ASEAN that Shiv mentioned. But just looking at COP, I mean, the commentary is mixed. You mentioned the commitments and what they amount to, Eugene, and it's understandable given the nature and severity of the challenge that people feel the commitments aren't really sufficient, but though they're not sufficient yet, that's clear. But I'm a sort of glass half full person, and the announcements on coal, on methane, on the availability of finance for transition, and the updated targets, while they don't get us there in one jump, you know, they are a vital and necessary step forward. So I think that's important. And you know, I spent, as was mentioned in the introduction, 5 years on the board of the World Bank, and it was around the time in 2010 that we were having a fierce debate about the relationship between development and climate, and there was understandably a sort of fear that as we focused on mitigation and adaptation in response to climate change, that might be at the expense of development finance. And after some debate, we came to the conclusion, and I think it was the right conclusion, that actually these are two sides of the same coin, and that, you know, climate change is actually one of the major drivers of development challenges. And so that when we try and think about how to address climate change, we are in fact addressing development. But I've noticed and been slightly disheartened that the debate has returned a little bit about looking at the sense of a trade-off between development and tackling climate. And so I was thinking, you know, how can we get away from that and back to the view that that these things are effectively the same. And I think there's a number of things that are important to that. One, of course, is making good on the 100 billion per annum commitment that's been around for around a decade and needs to be delivered. And the Green Climate Fund, the first big international financial institution based in Asia, needs to be a key part of that. I think the second is around capacity building and making sure that there's a transfer of knowledge and experience between those countries and institutions in the vanguard of this debate and the others, and that should cover, you know, lessons learned about the introduction of new technologies, you know, the regulatory thinking and policies that are incentivizing and driving change, but also importantly, I think capacity building in and by the financial sector. So that's where institutions such as Shiv's and mine have a real role to play through working with our clients on what they can expect of us and what we can you know, discuss with them about their approach to the transition. It involves initiatives like the IFC and HKMAs on an alliance for green commercial banks to build capacity in the banking system in the region, and also a lot of work that the banks will lead in terms of incentivizing through products and cheaper capital for sustainable investments, and working with supply chain finance to ensure that smaller firms are coming up to speed. So there's a lot that this sector can do. But the third thing I think that will help is and this is really getting to today's publication and announcement, is a recognition that the transition in ASEAN countries, particularly the least developed, will look different from the transition in advanced economies. There's a slight danger that in some of the language and the focus on, say, net zero by 2050, which is absolutely the right target at a planetary level and at an aggregate level to keep 1.5 degrees on the table. But, it's not necessarily going to be the appropriate target for each and every country and each and every economic actor. That wouldn't necessarily be consistent with a just transition. So I think over the next few months, agreeing how that decarbonisation burden share should look is going to be the big methodological challenge that we're going to come on to. And that can fit very nicely, I think, within the framework that you are setting out today. So today's announcement is a huge step forward. I know it's the result of a work of you, Eugene, and also a lot of colleagues in the ATB. And while the details still need to be filled in, and that's the purpose of your consultation and subsequent stages, setting out that framework and approach is the vital first step to put ASEAN at the table, to socialise their ideas of what the transition looks like with other international policymakers and with the financial community that I represent, so that we can get round the table and start planning. So a fantastic and important day.
Thanks very much, Stuart. I think you and Shiv have raised some very interesting points that I'd like to come back to later. But now perhaps we can get a slightly different perspective from Eric, who's a user of capital.
Yes, absolutely, Eugene, and good day to all. I totally agree with everything that has been said by our fellow panelists. Not going to repeat them. Perhaps I'd like to offer some fresh perspective, as you said, as a user of capital and an investor in sustainable investments. AC Energy is the energy platform of the Ayala Group, which is one of the largest business groups in the Philippines. And perhaps if you let me share the story, a very short story, encapsulating the 10 years of AC Energy in this market. I think our journey is a microcosm of the sustainability, this powerful force called sustainability, because we've pretty much tracked this powerful force through our life. When we started the business 10 years ago in the Philippines, serving an emerging market, we always had aspirations for a sustainability focus, but we quickly realized at that point in time, this was 10 years ago, that there was no choice for us but to invest in reliable and affordable energy. And at that time, like it or not, we made the tough choice of getting into thermal coal. That was what the country needed at that time. Renewables was very expensive and unreliable. Gas was still based on very long-term, risky, long-term take-or-pay contracts, as opposed to spot or shorter-term contracts that we see today. So there was really no choice for a market like Philippines. So I'm a relatively late, not late, but I wasn't a convert yet, so to speak, on this, all the sustainability focused efforts. We got to scale after 5 years, got to 1,000 megawatts, which is a reasonable scale and profitability. There was an inflection point in 2016, 2017. The UN SDG goals were being pushed. Renewables were getting closer to grid parity, and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel with battery storage becoming more and more promising, although it's still not as competitive as we would like for it to be today. And in the meantime, the coal assets were still trading at a premium, at least in this part of the world, because of their scale and usefulness in the market. So we decided to make that strategic pivot sometime in 2016-17 to start getting out of thermal and doubling down on renewables and virtually going all in over time in renewables. One can argue it was a tad early, 4 or 5 years ago. We took a risk, but we said this is the future, and we better set our sights on focusing on us being a renewables platform. And fast forward today, we've seen the emergence of the green bonds. We're one of the largest green bond issuers, certainly the largest in the Philippines and one of the larger ones in the region. We've issued the $1.6 billion of green bond using the ASEAN green bond standards, alongside with other standards like CBI, Climate Bond Initiative, and so forth. And that has helped us really propel, in addition to our capital recycling of the divestment of coal plants. We've complemented this with the very brisk and growing green bond market, as well as tapping not only the debt capital markets, but lately also the equity capital market. So today, we've grown several fold from a 70 megawatt portfolio of renewables in 2016. We were once upon a time 93% coal, 7% renewables, but today that's the other way around. We're more than 80% renewables and less than 20% coal. As we continue to divest our coal plants, is now down to around 60% of our peak levels, and our renewables grew almost 40-fold from 70 megawatts in 2016. We're going to close the year with close to 3,000 megawatts of renewables, and we've set this ambition of reaching or exceeding 5,000 megawatts of renewables by 2025. We'll probably exceed that number. So I think the one last thing I would say in this journey of sustainability is we've recently committed to net zero, both as our parent Ayala as well as ASEAN or AC Energy, just a few weeks ago, in line with the COP26 initiatives. And one of the things that we are doing differently, while we have a coal divestment policy, one of the key issues that were raised to us by stakeholders, especially ESG investors, while they hail our coal divestment policy and our ability to recycle the capital and scale up renewables, there is a concern that's raised, which is, aren't we passing the problem, the issue, to somebody else if we just divest the coal plant? So that gave us a pause, and Stuart mentioned the just transition as well. We're also members of the Just Energy Transition Initiative under the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. What we are now committed to do is to tap the energy transition mechanism that's being pushed by the likes of ADB as well, which is again an innovative approach to raise capital to take out coal plants and retire them earlier than their technical life. So that is one thing that we are pursuing. So as part of our transition plan, we will not only divest our coal plant, but we will do so in a just transition approach, which means that we will also commit and hold ourselves accountable for the early retirement of the plant, notwithstanding our planned divestment. So there's whole initiative put against this. I think there's going to be a lot of learnings. Hopefully, if we become the first, it would be a great pilot a project for everyone to learn. I think our hope is that this becomes a norm or a standard in this part of the world. In a market like Australia, where we also operate, it is normal for them to program, to schedule coal plant closure so that the rest of the system can plan. But not in Southeast Asia. We've got 30, 35-year-old plants still running with no end in sight. So hopefully with an orderly transition, we can set the pace in terms of what it takes to commit to close down a coal plant even way earlier than its useful technical life, which is usually 40 to 50 years, so that we can do a just and orderly transition. So this is relatively new. Hopefully the taxonomy will also cover that dynamic as opposed to just focus on renewables, but also we need to take care about how we unwind and how we manage this just transition, which includes the closure, hopefully early closure of coal plants, without shocking the system. Because again, we want to do it in a balanced way. We've seen what happened to Europe, China with the supply shocks, fossil fuel price shocks that we're experiencing today. Again, the fossil advocates or climate skeptics will say that's because the energy transition was done too abruptly. I think it highlights the fact that we need to properly manage this transition, especially in this part of the world.
Thank you, Eric. Well, you've all raised some very interesting and important points. And, there are also questions on the Q&A box, but I'd like to raised some issues, which I think will also answer the questions in the Q&A box in one way or another. But I feel that these are really important questions which go to the crux of the taxonomy. Now, the chair of the ATB, Madam Noor Rafida, noted just now in the keynote how diverse ASEAN is in many respects, right? Because of this, in the past, there's always been a lot of concern that it's not possible for a taxonomy to be both inclusive for all the ASEAN member states and credible at the same time. But now we have the ASEAN taxonomy that's been developed as an inclusive and credible taxonomy. And I noted some very interesting features just now incorporated into this. The first is, of course, the use of a multi-tiered approach that has a foundation framework and a plus standard. The second is the plus standard itself having tiers. Now, this approach is quite pioneering and seems to reflect what the Global Financial Markets Association and BCG's publication on climate finance markets and the real economy called for. And it said that taxonomy should be based on common global principles, something very similar to what Mushtaq had pointed out, but must be flexible in terms of both regional and temporal variation. Do you think that the differences between the ASEAN taxonomy in terms of its construct and other taxonomies, definitions and guidelines you know of today in the world are going to cause more fragmentation? Or do you think that they enable a new pathway for connecting global climate action efforts? Maybe I can invite Shiv to start first.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question. And I think my instinctive response is no, not at all. Not at all. I think this is something much needed. I mean, the point you made, that quote's a great one. You know, and I think my colleagues have made this point as well. We need to accept that different regions and different countries are going to come at this transition in different ways. And if you look at it, for many people, what we're looking for is not to impose the way they should do it, but for those regions and those countries to lift their voice and say, this is what we want to do. And I think that's exactly what the ATB's done. The ATB's provided leadership direction and said, right, this is it. This is the way we're going to go. It's not a complete piece of work, and it's an iterative piece of work and a living document, but this is the way we're going to go. And that's fantastic because it's a starting point and it's something we can negotiate off. I myself started this whole journey looking for some universal rules I could apply. So as soon as it became clear that transition finance and clean technology was a new way forward, as a banker, I was looking for angles, I was looking for ways to bring new products and ideas to clients. And even though many other organizations and countries and regions have come up with some very good starting points, principles, taxonomies, I think it's safe to say there's nothing out there that counts as a universally accepted precedent that absolutely everyone can look at. And I certainly struggle to look at all of the client base we have and say, right, this is exactly the place I should be classifying this name at, and this is what I should be expecting of it in its transition journey. Because every time we look and have those discussions, there's typically an argument to say, oh, you're not being fair because in this sector or in this country, these things are not as possible as they are in that country or that sector. So I don't think there's a perfect precedent, basically. Now, that's not surprising because the energy transition is hugely complex. So I'm not expecting anyone to come up with to one set of rules. I think everyone agrees on the end game. We all know where we want this to go, but I think the paths to get there are going to be different for different people. And I think it's very important that different people put their hands up to say, right, this is my path. This is the way I choose to go. If you want to discuss it with me or negotiate with me, let's do that. But it needs to be something that works for both of us. So that win-win. So I think multiple taxonomies are okay. In fact, I think they're inevitable considering all the different circumstances of all the different countries and regions out across the world. It's hard to find many things in life that are just globally applicable to every single person in every single country. It's just not the way things are done. What will have to be clear and what will have to be global is the metrics we use. So this is kind of like the language. We're going to need to agree what we record, how it's being recorded, how it's being disclosed. All that sort of stuff has to be relatively universal. There might be some things that are subject to translation, but we need to be talking about apples and apples. But the actual taxonomies and the thresholds, I still think that's up for discussion. In a way, you can think of it like a legal system. If you look at taxonomies and legal systems, every country has its own legal system. And that legal system, typically, if you go to different countries, weights mostly, and I know there's some differences, mostly weights a crime in a way that's fairly common. So for most countries, murder is the highest crime, and then things like a petty theft would obviously be considered a bit lower, and that's the way it is. But like legal systems, some countries are more credible than others and more transparent than others. And those countries tend to attract more investment or greater confidence or greater tourism, whatever it is. And I think it's going to be the same way with taxonomies. Taxonomies need to be clear and they need to be credible, right? So everyone can come up with their own taxonomy, but that need to be clear and credible is going to be absolutely vital to ensure that it actually helps the companies and the countries within your region. I think the last point I wanted to make is the point that was already made, which is if you consider ASEAN, if you consider the number of countries, the number of people, the stages of economic development, the fact that you've got fossil fuel exporters and fossil fuel importers, and different sectors. You know, you've got agriculture-based economies, and then you've got economies that are very reluctant on multinational corporation investment. It's very, very different. It's very diverse. And in many ways, it's a microcosm of what we're trying to do at a global scale, right? Because at a global scale, we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to take very different types of companies and different types of economies and get them together and basically get them to agree. To that end, I think this is a massive achievement for ASEAN. It's a great example to the whole world of how this can be done despite those differences. So, sorry, Eugene.
No, sorry, you froze for a while, so I thought you
Oh,
finished.
right, apologies. So hopefully that came across, but essentially it's a huge achievement for ASEAN, and I think it's something that you should be proud of, not just from an ESG standard, but as one of the great achievements of ASEAN to date, generally.
Thank you very much, Shiv. It's interesting you brought up the point about the diversity, because if you look at the GDP per capita per annum for ASEAN of 4,800 versus US dollars versus the EU's 34,000, and the highest GDP per capita of 64,000 in ASEAN versus the lowest of 1,400, the differences are very stark.
Yeah.
And this is where I think it's really interesting to look at how we have commonalities with other taxonomies. And Mushtaq, you brought that up just now in your opening. Would you like to share a bit more about that?
Sure. So maybe I'll just segue off of Shiv's comments, which I think were fantastic, really. And the way I look at taxonomy, I mean, we get asked all the time, are more taxonomies bad, or should there be one big universal taxonomy? Should there be multiple taxonomies? I mean, I think the question is a fair one, but I think the ultimate answer is it depends. What do the taxonomies actually contain? How are they going to be used? How will they impact the market? Will they make life easier for investors and issuers? Will they contribute to sustainable investment? These are the types, I mean, I love philosophy as much as anybody and happy to discuss it with you over noodles, but for the purposes of this taxonomy, I think the important thing is to look at what the actual real world impact is going to be. And from my involvement so far in the discussions and my albeit cursory look so far at the document that was released today, I do believe that the net impact will be positive. And I'm looking at it from a fairly narrow point of view from ICMA. Is this going to make it easier for issuers to issue, and is it going to make it easier for investors to invest in sustainable finance instruments? Is it going to facilitate that? Is it going to make those investments more credible for global investors? I think the answer is yes. And the reason is embedded in the principles of the ASEAN taxonomy that have been laid out, very, very clearly. The taxonomy, the ASEAN taxonomy, it's based as much as possible on existing standards, existing classifications. It takes into account the taxonomies that have already been developed and is basically trying to use their methodologies to grow from them. It can't be a perfect fit, but I think the overall philosophies have informed the creation of the ASEAN taxonomy. And it's also very much science-based. But at the same time, I think the main function of this taxonomy is to provide, how do I put it? I mean, for lack of a better word, just a framework for corporates, for banks, for ASEAN market participants to be able to take their strategy, take their pathway, for example, and say, okay, according to the ASEAN taxonomy, we are consistent with foundational framework green, or with this tier, for example. And that's basically a shortcut for international investors, for anyone who's looking at them, for a regulator, for example, to look at the overall sustainability of a particular entity and see immediately that they are at this level according to the ASEAN taxonomy. The ASEAN taxonomy itself has been very carefully designed, very carefully considered by all the governments in ASEAN, by the leading experts in the market, or many of the leading experts in the market, and represents a very broad consensus of different official sector and private sector participants, as well as climate experts. Okay, so having that kind of a framework at the ASEAN level that takes into account individual ASEAN markets, individual ASEAN economies, and corporate journeys, as been shared already, that's extremely powerful, because that would be very difficult if you have a company in the Philippines, for example, trying to comply with the EU taxonomy. The outcome would not be the same. But here you can say, according to the ASEAN taxonomy, here we are, and that allows much easier decision making. Some investors globally may not, they may think that some of the tiers are inadequate. They may think that some of the aspects on the classifications of the ASEAN taxonomy are not there. But what the ASEAN taxonomy does is it allows different tiers, right? So you can, in a sense, you can choose which tier that you're going to have the ambition to work towards, and then you're very transparent about exactly where you are in comparison to global taxonomies and global standards. So I know that's a bit long-winded, but I think the overall point I would like to make is that this actually makes it much easier for participants outside of ASEAN and many of ICMA stakeholders to understand more easily what the sustainability credentials and pathways are of potential ASEAN issuers.
Thanks, Mushtaq. That's really interesting. And your last point resonates a lot with what Stuart was talking about. Getting a taxonomy that's suitable, that can support that transition. And Stuart, maybe I can invite you to share a bit more on those views.
Yeah. So, well, you stole my thunder slightly, Eugene, because these figures that you quoted on the comparisons of GDP per capita, which I think were in our report that we sent in earlier, I think they helpfully illustrate just the real difference of the in ASEAN economies from Myanmar to Singapore. And what I think you've managed to do with this is to put a framework around that can encompass all these countries and the different challenges they will face in transition, and that's really important. I think it's a really great starting point. That said, it's probably a little bit more complicated. We all have to sort of absorb it and think about how it's going to work. Than some of the other sort of, say, the EU's singular approach. But I don't think it's overly complex. And once we, socialize it and begin to understand how it will operate, I think, as others have said, that this will help finance flow. There's a couple of things that occur to me that will maximize its credibility, if you like. The first thing that's welcome is, if one imagines the less ambitious tiers falling away over time, and you're left with your more ambitious tier, which you explicitly in the document say will be aligned, and I'm afraid I can't remember the exact words, but it will, be Paris aligned or aligned to net zero by 2050 at the most ambitious tier. So in time, you're effectively committing to the same sort of target that everyone else is committing to, and that's great. That's really welcome. I think it's also important, of course, we've had a number of countries that have moved ahead and put in place taxonomies within the ASEAN region, and it's obviously important that these come into line and are clearly fit within the framework that's been announced today. But I'm sure that is what individual ASEAN member states will try and do. I think the sunsetting of your less ambitious tiers is great. I think that gives a credibility, so it allows us, as you point out, to recognize the different starting points and the different challenges. But then over time, you're bringing everybody to the sort of same place. So I think that's important incentive for progress. And your most ambitious tier I think in time we hope to see some targets in there, obviously, actually in all the tiers, but not just destination targets that are several decades out. Also, I think important to have some shorter term targets so that economic planners and financiers can organize themselves around these shorter term ambitions. So, effectively, you're creating a sort of glide path, but you have a number of different glide paths depending on the starting point at any given time. So I think it's credible. I think it's a great framework. And as for its compatibility with other exercises, I mean, the Common Ground taxonomy, I think, has been released just a few days ago for consultation. And I haven't had a chance to absorb that, but that looks to have some sort of interoperability between, say, China's taxonomy and the EU's. And I think we need to bring ASEAN's into that discussion now. And that's partly up to ASEAN to make that happen, but it's also actually up to those that are already around the table on the international platform that the European Commission runs, and to make sure that they bring the ASEAN taxonomy into that picture and ensure interoperability with that as well, which I think should be perfectly possible.
Thanks very much, Stuart. I picked up a few points from what all of you said, and the first is, of course, transition. The second is different starting points, and the third is credibility. And you touched a lot on the credibility just now, Stuart. And the ASEAN taxonomy tries to facilitate the transition ASEAN needs by getting everyone on board as quickly as possible and not waiting for the perfect. But this means now that we have a principles-based foundation framework and a plus standard with multiple thresholds, as you pointed out, that allow for different starting points. And this is something many of you have raised. Obviously, the foundation framework is there to provide the inclusivity that's so important to ASEAN. It enables everyone to start their sustainability journey. And the thresholds with different starting points for the plus standard are again to allow for the different circumstances of the AMS, like you've pointed out, for the different ASEAN member states. I'm actually struck by what the Prime Minister of Denmark said on her recent visit to India, and I quote, she said, Denmark and India's different starting points are very different. And it's much easier for Denmark, it's much easier for Europe to have ambitious goals. But at the same time, if you and the other countries all did the same mistakes as we did then, we'll not reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. So you need to act in a manner that's smarter than we did. Of course, that's edited. But do you think, based on the discussions we've had and extrapolating that, do you think that the design of the ASEAN taxonomy can address the need for different starting points while enabling ASEAN to act smartly? I mean, does the unconventional design actually compromise its credibility? And I know you touched on it that it could be a strength just now, Stuart. But I'd just like to open up to maybe Mushtaq, Eric, and Shiv to maybe give some comments first. And if I can invite Mushtaq to start.
Sure, Eugene. I think that I'll make a really quick point because I'd like to actually hear the other panelists on this. But I noticed the title of this webinar. What is it? It's facilitating transition toward a sustainable ASEAN, right? The purpose of the taxonomy is not to tell the world and dictate what is green and what is not green, or exactly what everybody has to do today and tomorrow to divest in order to reach 1.5 degree change. It's facilitating transition. That is the idea. And I think the taxonomy actually, again, it remains to be seen how it will actually be implemented, but I think it goes a long way. What it's doing is the philosophy that I've seen behind this is that it's bringing everyone in the tent, right? It's not excluding industries. It's not excluding participation. It's saying everyone in the market, everyone in the economy can be part of transition, and everyone needs to be. And the taxonomy is trying to get everyone in there. Now, is there going to be criticism that maybe some of the tiers are not ambitious enough? Yes. Are some of the participants going to be going to tiers that are and issuing sustainable finance instruments that are maybe considered not as rigorous enough for other international standards? Quite possibly, but this is the first step. And I think, one of your mottos is that we can't achieve perfection. We don't have time to, and I think that's absolutely right. I think even if you look at the political situation, even if you look at the science, it is constantly changing. So even attaining perfection is in principle not possible. So we have to actually start on a process rather than put very rigid rules that that basically leave out many of the potentially positive impacts in the market. And that's what ICMA's philosophy is as well in our guidelines, right? We're not setting absolute standards for emission or divestment or exact kind of sustainability goals. What we're doing is saying they have to be ambitious, they have to be benchmarkable, they have to be transparent, and they have to be verified. These are the general principles that we're trying to achieve for ICMA, and let the market decide, and let the scientists decide, and let the people decide, what is good enough.
Eugene, I guess from, again, a practitioner's or a user's perspective, I'm actually glad that this is all happening because, 2 or 3 years ago, I wish that this taxonomy was already right there, right for the picking, because we did it the hard way. 3 years ago, we didn't have any framework, nomenclature, etc., any system that gets us organized on policy or a management system with respect to environmental and social standards. We took advantage we leveraged the green bond and our anchor investors, particularly IFC and ADB, to help us first craft our E&S policy management system that comes with it, all the framework and all of these definitions, metrics, standards, processes, etc. We had to hire a full-time consultant, consult with IFC ADB. And what we came up with first was a gold standard, because we know what the IFC ADB standards are. They are world-class standards. And we said, look, we cannot apply all of that in the markets where we operate. Maybe in some projects, in some markets, yes, in certain situations, right? But not for all. So guess what we ended up with? 3 different tiers. So I was really smiling when I saw the the foundation and the plus. It's no different than what we came up 3 years ago in our own system. It really depends not only by market where we operate, but also by project and by circumstance. Now, it would be great if you can hand this off to any other company so that you will save them a lot of time. We invested a lot of time, but now that you've got this or having this, I think it would be great for companies regardless of sector or market for that matter. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Eric. Oh, before I had to shift, I just, Mushtaq, I'm absolutely thrilled that you remember our conversations. And yes, I did say perfect isn't good enough for ASEAN anymore. And we just really have to get everyone on board. And Eric, you raised a good point. I mean, the taxonomy is also to help companies individually try and chart their journey. And that's where I think, the tiers had come in to be a bit more useful. Shiv, perhaps you'd like to share your views on this as well.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, I think just repeating the point, I think Stuart touched upon, but we definitely talked about it quite a bit in our working group, is what is critical is that ASEAN has now joined the narrative, and ASEAN is making its point, and ASEAN is taking a position. And the reason that's important is, as I mentioned earlier in my opening speech, this is inevitable. This wave is inevitable, and it's coming. But people are willing to listen. But if you're not going to say something, if you're not going to take hold of a narrative, then you're going to have to follow someone else's. Because people will say, well, if you haven't got something, I'll just use the closest thing. And that's risky. That's risky for anyone because, exactly to Eric's point, these things are always difficult because there's always lots of different views and opinions, and you're not necessarily capturing everything, and particularly if you haven't had a voice in the formation of something. The thing that's really important is that, look, we all know the planet can't afford for a single country not to take this seriously, right? This is really, really important. But we also know that when it comes to change, big change and uncertainty, people are generally very conservative. They're very careful. And the best thing to do is get them on board. Get them on board with whatever works at that point in time. Look, bring them along, because we all know this isn't a perfect journey. We all know we're not at the final destination. We know it's going to evolve. But what you want is people on board the train. And if getting them on board the train means making some concessions or making some points now that aren't necessarily ideal, then so be it. Because once they're on board and once we've got momentum, they're all going to be part of the story. They're going to be thinking the right way. They're going to be moving in the right direction. And I think that's really important. And that's what this taxonomy is going to do. I think a point just on the design, the unconventional design for me is not an issue. I think this is a time for creativity. And I think, this type of creativity is very helpful. To Mushtaq's earlier point, whether or not it works is going to be the key point. But the reality is being creative and being willing to change the taxonomy, but making it a living document, making it an iterative process is the most important thing. Because I suspect there's going to be a lot of negotiation, there's going to be a lot of discussion, and things are going to be tailored as time goes on. But it's absolutely great that we've come up with something that works, or at least works for ASEAN. And even if it is a bit unusual, then so be it. I just wanted to also just add that I like the idea of the tiers. I think one of the biggest issues we've got currently with clients is how do we judge clients? How do we actually make a fair comparison of where a company is? And quite often the difference between sector and the difference between regions, it becomes a big factor in the discussion. So using this, even if it's on a tiered basis, it's much easier for companies, banks like us to say, right, this client is saying this is where they are, but actually if we look at the tier system, is it fair? Is it reasonable? Have they got good reasons for not being on the same tier as one of their competitors? All that sort of discussion becomes a lot easier and it becomes a lot more transparent, which makes obviously the whole market find it a lot easier to judge whether or not a company is doing the right thing at the right time.
Thanks, Shiv. That's really enlightening. I want to come back to something Stuart mentioned just now. It's about net zero 2050. Now, a lot of taxonomies actually benefit from being guided by net zero goals, and ASEAN doesn't have a net zero goal yet. Does this affect the effectiveness of the ASEAN taxonomy in the absence of a net zero for ASEAN? What's the best way to guide the taxonomy? Maybe Stuart, you raised the net zero. Perhaps I can invite you to start.
Yeah. So listen, I think what's important is the substance. The decarbonization, a relatively clear destination out there, the end decades. But then also some much shorter term targets, say for peak emissions or emission intensity reduction that can allow economic actors to plan. But the most important thing about the transition and its destination is that it should be Paris aligned, regardless of how one describes that. Now, having said all that, net zero 2050 is certainly a very useful tool for many operators to choose to have a clear aim and target. Certainly, my bank is signed up through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero to that target, and we're working through what that's going to mean for our operations now. So I'm fully supportive of it. And it's very important at the aggregate level, to keep 1.5 degrees on the table. But what's most important is just the substance of the transition. Immediately having shorter term targets, I think helps. And my personal view is that it will be irresistible for ASEAN not to have some sort of description of its destination in net zero terms eventually. But I don't think it's you pay a particular price for that right now. And as I said earlier, to be honest, the way you've described the most ambitious tier in this taxonomy as being effectively net zero aligned, that I think is a very important signal to the market and to where ASEAN is going to go in the medium term on this. So I think that's very powerful and will be picked up and noticed by other policymakers and planners.
Thanks, Stuart. Shiv, I saw you nodding your head. I gather you're in agreement with what Stuart says.
Yeah, absolutely. I was kind of thinking of this in two. There are two. Let's bifurcate it. Why does net zero matter? I think net zero is inevitable. Personal opinion. I think it's inevitable for every country and probably every company eventually. It's just I think the accepted end goal for any organization operating. And if you're not going to call it now, then I think inevitably you're going to have to declare it at some point. And the argument for an end goal is like anything in life, you need to know what you're aiming for. It's always helpful to say, right, that's my target. And then everything you work to, you can actually judge how close you are to that final target. And then net zero also sends a strong signal to the market. That's one of the best things about it. And we've seen a lot of companies and countries say, we've got net zero targets, and not necessarily have a very clear pathway to it, but actually send that signal out. And also, helps with their own planning process from that. Now everyone within that organization needs to think about, right, why, how are we going to actually do this day to day or year on year? Now, the second part is, why does it not matter for now? Because I have thought about this as well. I think we discussed this on the working groups as well. There are lots of politics and practicalities that make that declaration very complicated. And when you've got lots of different nations and lots of different types of economies, as we mentioned already, it's obviously going to be even more tricky. But the directional element here should not be underplayed, right? The point is that, okay, we haven't made the net zero declaration yet, and we, for the entire region, but the direction is there. And that's the key thing. The key thing is that people have just started to say, right, this is the way we're going to go. And like I say, ultimately, I think net zero will be inevitable, but it's not likely to be inevitable if you haven't started on that journey. So I really think the directional piece is more important for now. And then planning and setting targets and metrics for the short term is something, Stuart, you mentioned as well. I think that's absolutely critical, because I can understand that planning out for 30 years or perhaps longer and saying, right, this is the pathway which my company or my country is going to go on, and by this year or this decade, I'm going to be doing this. I can understand how difficult that is, because half the time you're relying on technologies that haven't necessarily been fully invented yet or aren't commercially viable yet. But you also have issues with planning around, well, what will my population size be? And, what will be the different dynamics of my economy? That's difficult. But what you can do is short-term plan. You can say, for the next few years, this is what I'm going to do. And I am going to use technologies. I am going to use methods that are already proven and that are available to me. And by doing that, you immediately show your credibility. You show that actually, look, I may not have that far-sighted net zero target yet, but you can see that I'm moving in the right direction day to day with my own company. And it goes to that old point. You can't improve what you don't measure. Right. So that whole point of, are you measuring what you're doing now and are you moving forward in the short term, obviously relates very closely to that statement. That's probably my main points on that, Eugene.
Thank you very much, Shiv. Eric, as a company who has its own net zero targets, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I think, Eugene, we're relatively new to the net zero journey, where it is a leap of faith, right? To Shiv's point, we don't know all the answers yet. We don't know what technologies will help us get there. So in a large part, it's a leap of faith. It's a journey. We've hired a consultant to help us take us through the journey to be able to flesh out the roadmap, milestones, and so forth. But one thing I'd like to share, one of the pain points or key concerns of some of our group companies, some of the CEOs, in terms of the concern in committing to net zero, is the fear of the unknown, especially on the scope 3, right? The dreaded scope 3. Not only does it potentially impose a lot of strain on information overload requests and so forth on the organization, but also how do you manage this entire ecosystem, supply chain, what have you? How can you influence it? Is it too extreme? Banks, for example, are touted to have really huge scope 3 emissions by virtue of who they lend to, right? I would argue, isn't there triple, quadruple, quintuple counting in terms of scope 3? So I think there's still a whole slew of undeveloped approach in terms of how to manage this supply chain ecosystem. It's again, maybe it's out of ignorance because I haven't gone through the full journey of what it means really to be net zero and how to manage the scope 3. But from the point of view of someone who is not fully familiar yet, it could be daunting. And that could be a barrier for a lot of organizations to commit, which is sad because that may not necessarily be the right reason. So I think to the extent that the taxonomy board can address this, the uncertainty, demystify scope 3, or at least highlight what are the issues and the fact that there is a path forward in terms of addressing those issues. But I think there's something there. I do agree with the Shiv that at some point everyone will have to commit. There's no choice, but everyone will have to commit to net zero. It's the life of the planet at stake here. But it's easier said than done, especially if you have these fears, especially for rational people who say, if I commit, I want to know how to get to that goal. Why should I? It feels irresponsible otherwise. So I think this is one challenge ahead of us in terms of figuring out how to get others to commit to net zero.
Thank you very much. I think that's very insightful. I do understand the concerns not just of companies but also of countries in committing to something where they're uncertain how much support will be given to them to achieve that, and what sort of technology will be there for them. Mushtaq, I'm just wondering whether you have any views on this, because I know that we talked about directional importance. Maybe you'd like to share something.
Sure, and maybe I'm going a little bit off piste here, stepping outside of my ICMA comfort zone. So if you'll allow me to maybe share some more personal thoughts. I think Eric's comments are really important and really essential, because we see a lot, and I see this quite a lot. We talk to corporates, we talk to smaller banks, smaller asset managers, and there's a sense of concern, especially in Asia, that if you are committing to a sustainable strategy, if you are, at least the perception is that you're making certain sacrifices to be more sustainable. Is your lunch going to be eaten by other people? If you're divesting in hard to abate sectors, are those assets just going to be picked up by other market participants for a future profit, right? So there is this concern. And at the same time, what we've seen in parallel, and I'm sure all the panelists and audience have seen this as well, is from certain sectors, skepticism about the role of the financial system in pushing sustainability, right? The ultimate question is, can the finance industry, can sustainable finance market itself drive net zero strategies, drive the amount of investment that's necessary to reach the 1.5 target, to net zero targets? And in my personal opinion, the answer is probably not. Right? I mean, the financial industry can help facilitate that. Initiatives such as the ASEAN Taxonomy can go an enormously long way to help move that along. And the leadership of people like Eric in the corporate sector can also help. But what you also need, and I think what the planet needs, frankly, is that leadership at the highest levels of government, at the political level, to guide the financial industry. Because ultimately, we're all rational actors, and especially most of the senior bankers I've worked with, they're very rational actors. Even retail investors are rational actors, right? They're going to look at what is going to have the best risk-adjusted return for me in the long term. And if it's clear that that we're going to be implementing policies to save the planet, then that's going to have overall economic structural implications, and the financial sector will price those in and will factor those in. If there is a perception in the market that all of this is not really going to happen, there's still climate skepticism and so forth, that there's still arbitrages to be made in fossil fuels and non-environmental industries, then the markets will follow that as well. Right. So I do think that now is really a kind of a crucial point where the financial industry is already turning a corner. Maybe it's not completely there yet, but we're almost there. But I think it's going to have to be supported by regulation and by overall environmental policy at the national level. And I think actually the financial sector and those of us involved and who already believe the science have to advocate for that as well.
It's really interesting you went into that, Mushtaq, because we have a question in the Q&A box, and the question is, should policymakers look to regulations to encourage sustainability and use the top-down approach? And I think you've given some perspectives on that. Let me just quickly go around to the other panelists to see what their views on this are. Should policymakers look to regulations to encourage sustainability? So in addition to the market discipline, Eric, can I maybe invite you to share your views?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Eugene?
Well, the question is, should policymakers look to using regulations to encourage sustainability? That is using the top-down approach.
No, I certainly think so, and we operate in different markets in Southeast Asia. And my point of view there is, I think there's three things that policymakers need to consider to really encourage the rollout of sustainable investments. So number one is to have an ambitious and clear goal, whether it's net zero related or renewables target related. And we've seen governments across the region do that. Vietnam has clear goals. Indonesia recently also defined their ambitions on renewables, Philippines and so forth. But it's not enough. I think the second component is to have the enabling policies and framework to support these goals. And this is where we see some separation of some markets. Vietnam has a good follow-through, and that's why it's the hottest market in renewables today. It's got a very ambitious goal. It's got clear framework. And then the third aspect is execution, implementation, right? And again, I think Philippines has a clear goal. We've got renewable energy law. We lack in execution and implementation still of a lot of these policies. So Indonesia has recently stated its ambitions, and people are still waiting for what are the enabling laws and policies, and we are patiently awaiting. So it's different strokes for different markets, but I think it's fairly important for policymakers to get these three things right to really harness all of these much needed sustainable investments. And then we will respond. The investors will go where these conditions are right.
Thank you. Let me follow on from what you just said, Eric. So obviously one of the main roles of the ASEAN taxonomy is actually to orient capital into activities and investments that support sustainability. And if it can't perform this role effectively, then it's essentially failed. Now, how do you think the ASEAN taxonomy will be useful in helping the allocation of capital? You gave some examples from your experience just now. But what do we need to make the taxonomy more effective in this role?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, you're already recognizing the differences in the different markets. And I think having a common set of principles while allowing for flexibility across markets it's important thing. Number one. Number two, I think you want to encourage a lot of issuers, investors to tap the sustainable financing and so forth. And I think based on our conversations with other groups, I think sometimes the requirements can be just so overwhelming and complicated as well. So I think a simplification will also help. I'll give you one example: sustainability-linked bonds, which is the recent popular thing. Unfortunately, there's still a whole long list of requirements that eat into the execution time, for example. So in our own experience, we had to defer this because you have to also manage the timing of the market, right? If you don't move fast enough, the market could get away from you, right? So in our own experience, while we would have loved to do a sustainability-linked bond, because of the complexities that came with it, we decided not to pursue with it and do something we're already primed to do, which is the green bond framework. So I think complexity is a consideration, especially if you want to build a market. The simpler, the better. So I think if we can take this into consideration, it would get more participants, more issuers to jump in. So I think the tiering could also help. If you have a foundational framework that's common to all, that's relatively easy, and then you make people be more aspirational and set those higher standards and so forth. So I think it's a great framework to use, even in espousing a green bond or sustainability linked frameworks.
Thank you, Eric. As a bank, what do you think, Shiv?
Yeah, in terms of attracting finance, well, look, I would say transition finance, you probably couldn't find a hotter topic in financial markets or financial institutions than transition finance. Absolutely everybody is keen on it. Absolutely everybody is keen to be part of it, keen to drive it, keen to find their place in it, keen to be a leader in it. Now, the reason is it's going to be a key determinant, obviously, for the success of the energy transition. The second thing is it's an absolutely enormous potential market. It's even bigger than the green finance market because you're talking about all those industries, nearly every industry in the world that isn't just naturally green, that's moving in a green direction is going to be caught in this. So there's absolutely huge amounts of appetite to do it. So then the natural question you're going to ask is, well, why hasn't anyone done it? And that comes to answer your question. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say why hasn't anyone done it. People have obviously put out transition finance type financings out there, but it hasn't been an avalanche. It's been a bit more of a trickle than an avalanche, even in the EU. And the main reason is related to exactly what we're talking about. I think banks are waiting to hear the rules of the game. And this is where policy, to your earlier question, is so important. You know, we're on the field, we've got a ball, but we don't know where the lines are. We don't quite know where the rules are. And so the danger is everyone's scared of doing something that means you're going to be called for a foul, or someone says, oh, that's not allowed. So when we know where those lines are and where the rules are, the banks are absolutely ready to go, right? They want to make sure they know that the clients they're backing are credible, the transition plans are credible, and they need something credible to compare that to. And this is where the policymakers play an absolutely fundamental role. So I don't think we should for 1 minute think banks are looking to back out of this. They're absolutely keen to lean in on transition finance. Everyone is keen on ASEAN. It's one of the great growing markets of the world. So I think there's absolutely room for an absolutely exponential growth in this if we can get these taxonomies right.
Thank you. Do you think there are any other components that we need to bulk up on, Stuart, to get this going?
Well, you know, I'm slightly disappointed to hear of Eric's experience. I think I totally take your point, and I think as we get more liquidity in the market, that some of these frictional sort of issues will hopefully fall away. But I'm sure Shiv and I will be rushing to the phone to get in touch with you after. But more generally, though, to your point, so it's absolutely vital what the governments and international organizations put in place, the framework within which the market is going to operate. You know, the market is a very sophisticated ecosystem, but its motivations are actually pretty simple. And so if you put the right framework around it in terms of regulations, guidelines, enforcement of these, etc., then the market will will set off in the direction that you've set it off, which is really important. And the sort of things, so I remember, and I'm sure all of us probably are old enough, unfortunately, to remember the ozone hole in the 80s and the action that was taken to ban chlorofluorocarbons from refrigeration systems and aerosols and all that kind of stuff. And that was necessary. And then, of course, the market and consumers could then deliver, on that policy that helped repair the ozone hole. And now you could see different targets coming in for combustion engine scrapping or new combustion engine cars, building standards, disclosure requirements, so that we can measure things accurately and know where we are on this pathway. A lot of countries beginning to obligate and mandate the sort of TCFD type disclosure rules. I think that's important. And even things like the prudential framework incentivizing sustainable investments and credit over non-sustainable. So that framework role of government is absolutely vitally important to move things. And the other area that it's quite important is actually the cooperation on balance sheets, blended finance, and being able to, if you like, leverage the private sector and allow us to go into places where the risk return might not enable us just to go on a purely commercial decision. So we've been involved. Eric mentioned the energy transition mechanism that the ADB is behind. That's a super sort of initiative that we hope to get involved in. There's also other mechanisms of blending finance where an authority like, say, Temasek takes a degree of risk and allows you to fund operations that wouldn't otherwise be commercially viable. So that public-private cooperation, it's vital across the piece.
Thank you very much. Well, we could really go on for half a day more, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So I just wanted to thank all of you for making time to be here, giving some ideas, sharing your insights. I think, it's really encouraging, the things we've heard from you. And certainly the ATB will be working very hard to make sure that this taxonomy is going to be effective, it's going to be useful, and it's going to be really something that moves the needle for the transition journey for all of ASEAN. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Back to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Eugene, and thank you as well to our distinguished panel for all of your insights today. Hopefully, discussions like these will help carry us that much closer towards that sustainable future we all hope is not too far at hand. Now, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that brings us to the end of our webinar session today. Thank you for your questions. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we couldn't address them all. And thank you once again for joining us today and spending time with us here. We hope you've enjoyed the session. It has been an honor to have all of you at this webinar. Now, until we meet again, take care, stay safe, and I do hope to see you all again.